The summer heat hung thick in the air, pressing down on the small town like a heavy quilt. It was the kind of summer where time slowed, where cicadas hummed in endless rhythm, and where childhood bonds either deepened or unraveled. For me, it was the summer I saw my cousin Ariv in a way I never had before. Ariv and I had always been close. We grew up together, our families intertwined in that effortless way that only blood ties allow. Every summer, we would gather at our grandparents' countryside home, a sprawling, time-worn estate with sun-bleached wooden floors and wide, creaking porches. It was our shared sanctuary, a place where we could escape from school, responsibilities, and the watchful eyes of our parents. This year, however, something was different. I felt it the moment Ariv walked through the front door, his frame taller, shoulders broader, presence somehow more commanding than I remembered. He carried himself with an ease that I had never possessed, his confidence effortless, his laughter richer. There was something else too, something I couldn't quite name but felt deep in my chest. We slipped into our usual rhythm with ease, sneaking out at dusk to chase fireflies, whispering secrets under the sprawling banyan tree, and stealing snacks from the kitchen late at night. But as the days passed, I began to notice the subtle shifts between us. His lingering glances, the way his arm would brush against mine and stay just a second too long. I told myself it was nothing, but even then, a part of me knew I was lying. The first hug, a moment of comfort. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, we sat on the back porch, watching the sky burn gold and crimson. The air was thick with unspoken words. I could feel him watching me, his presence as tangible as the warm breeze that wrapped around us. "You've been quiet today," he said suddenly, his voice softer than usual. I hesitated, staring at the distant tree line. "Just thinking." Ariv shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. "About what?" I exhaled slowly, struggling to find the right words. How could I explain the strange emotions twisting inside me? The way my heart leaped whenever he smiled? The way his touch left a trail of heat on my skin? Instead, I shook my head. Nothing important. He didn't believe me. I could tell by the way his brows knit together, by the way his fingers tapped absently against his knee. Then, without warning, he reached for me, pulling me into a hug. It wasn't the kind of embrace we had shared as kids, carefree, impulsive. This was different. His arms tightened around me, his warmth seeping through my shirt, his heartbeat steady against mine. It was grounding and terrifying all at once. I wanted to pull away, to laugh it off, to pretend it meant nothing. But I didn't. I stayed there, breathing him in, memorizing the way he fit against me. "You can tell me anything, you know," he murmured. I swallowed hard. "I know." Unspoken tension and self-doubt. After that night, everything changed. It wasn't anything obvious. No grand confessions, no dramatic moments. Just small shifts, little things that most people wouldn't notice but that felt monumental to me. The way he would find excuses to touch me. A hand on my back as we walked, fingers grazing my wrist as we reached for the same book. The way he would watch me when he thought I wasn't looking. And then there were the silences. Charged, heavy, filled with possibilities I didn't dare to name. I told myself I was imagining it, that this was just Ariv being his usual affectionate self, that I was reading too much into things. But the doubt lingered, whispering in the back of my mind. One evening, as we lay in the grass beneath the stars, I finally found the courage to ask, "Do you ever feel like something's different this year?" Ariv turned his head, his gaze meeting mine in the dim light. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Yeah." My breath caught. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "I don't know. It just feels like..." He trailed off, exhaling sharply. "Forget it." But I couldn't forget it. Not when my heart was racing. Not when his words left a crack in the wall I had so carefully built around my feelings, foreshadowing the conflict. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized two things. The first was that I was falling for Ariv. The second was that nothing about this could end well. Because love, real love, wasn't supposed to feel this complicated. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the truth loomed over me, dark and unavoidable. Something between us had changed, and there was no going back. The days blurred together, stretched thin by the weight of something neither of us dared to name. Ariv and I still spent every waking moment together, but there was a change, a quiet tension humming beneath the surface, crackling like static in the air between us. It was in the way his gaze lingered a second too long when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his hand would brush against mine, the touch feather-light but deliberate. It was in the hesitations, the half-spoken sentences, the way laughter sometimes died too quickly between us. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was projecting my own restless feelings onto him. But I couldn't ignore the way my pulse quickened when he was near or the way I found myself watching him, memorizing the curve of his smile, the easy grace in his movements. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we found ourselves alone in the attic, a quiet, forgotten space filled with old trunks and dust-coated memories. It had always been our hideout as kids, a place where the world outside couldn't reach us. But that night it felt different, a moment of no return. Ariv was sitting on the wooden floor, his back against an old chest, absent-mindedly flipping through a photo album we had found buried beneath stacks of forgotten belongings. I sat beside him, close enough that our knees touched. "Look at this," he murmured, turning the album toward me. It was a picture of us as kids, barefoot, grinning, arms slung over each other's shoulders like we owned the world. I chuckled softly. We had no idea how complicated things would get. "Huh?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he traced a finger over the edges of the photo, his expression unreadable. "Would you go back?" I hesitated. "To when we were kids?" He nodded. I thought about it, about how simple things had been before I realized that my feelings for him weren't just admiration, weren't just the bond of two cousins who had grown up like brothers. Before I realized that when he touched me, I wanted him to linger. "No," I said finally. "Would you?" Ariv exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know." He turned his head then, looking at me, really looking. "But sometimes, I wish things were easier." I swallowed, my throat dry. "What do you mean?" The silence stretched between us, heavy with unsaid things. And then, before I could process what was happening, his hand lifted, fingers brushing against my jaw. Tentative, unsure. I should have pulled away. I should have said something to break the spell, to steer us back to safe ground. But I didn't. I stayed still, heart hammering, breath caught somewhere between anticipation and fear. "Ariv," I whispered. He hesitated for only a second. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he leaned in. The kiss that changed everything. His lips met mine, soft, uncertain, a question more than a statement. The world outside faded, the attic shrinking into nothing but this moment, this impossible, inevitable thing between us. For a heartbeat, I didn't move. But then, as if something inside me had snapped, I responded. Leaning in, fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. The kiss was everything and nothing, too much and not enough. It was heat and confusion, longing and fear tangled together. And just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. A noise from downstairs, a door creaking open, voices floating up the staircase. We broke apart instantly, breaths ragged, wide eyes staring at each other in the dim light. Ariv was the first to move, scrambling to his feet as if burned. "We should go," he said, voice strained. I nodded, throat tight, words failing me. As we made our way downstairs, the world seemed to shift back into place. The house was the same. Our family still laughed in the kitchen, unaware of the moment that had just unraveled in the attic. But everything felt different, because now there was no denying it. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The weight of silence. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind. I should have felt guilty. I should have been terrified. But all I felt was an ache, a deep, unshakable longing for something I couldn't name. I wanted him, and for the briefest moment I thought maybe, just maybe, he wanted me too. But when morning came, everything had changed. Ariv avoided my gaze, his usual warmth replaced by something distant, unreadable. The easy closeness we had shared was gone, replaced by a careful distance that felt like a knife to my chest. I tried to act normal, to pretend that nothing had happened, but the silence between us grew heavier with each passing hour. It was as if the kiss had fractured something between us, something fragile and unspoken. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking. I wanted to know if he regretted it, if he wished it hadn't happened. But I was afraid of the answer, because deep down I already knew. A wall between us. Days passed, and Ariv remained distant. He still laughed with me, still sat beside me at meals, but the invisible thread that had once tied us together had frayed. One afternoon, as we sat outside watching the sun dip below the trees, I finally broke the silence. "Are we going to talk about it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ariv didn't look at me. Instead, he stared straight ahead, fingers gripping the wooden railing of the porch. "There's nothing to talk about." His words felt like a slap. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him that there was everything to talk about, but he shook his head. "It was a mistake," he said, voice flat. "That's all." A sharp pain twisted in my chest. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was lying, that I had seen the way he had looked at me, felt the way he had kissed me. But the words caught in my throat, because I realized then that no matter what I said, it wouldn't change the truth. Ariv had made his choice, and for the first time, I understood that wanting someone wasn't always enough. Foreshadowing the betrayal. That night, I watched him from across the room, feeling the distance grow, feeling him slip further away from me with each passing second. Something between us had broken, and I had no idea if we could ever fix it. The silence between Ariv and me thickened like an approaching storm, its weight pressing down on me with every passing day. What had once been effortless between us, shared laughter, unspoken understanding, was now forced, brittle, teetering on the edge of collapse. He was avoiding me, not overtly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I could feel it in the subtle ways he withdrew. His touch, once casual and lingering, was now absent. His eyes, which had once held warmth, flickered past me as if I were just another face in the crowd. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it, that maybe I had read too much into the kiss, that maybe he regretted it and just needed time. But deep down, I knew better. The first crack in my delusion appeared one afternoon when I saw him with Mira. She was one of the girls from town, pretty in a way that made people stare. A confident smile, sun-kissed skin, and a laugh that carried through the air. She had always been around during the summers, part of the larger group of kids who roamed the countryside, but she had never been close to Ariv. Until now. I watched from the porch as she nudged his shoulder, her laugh ringing out like a bell. Ariv grinned, that easy, charming smile that had once been reserved for me. And when she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. Something inside me cracked. A painful realization. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just trying to move on from whatever had happened between us. That maybe he thought being with Mira would erase what we had done, what we had felt. But as the days passed, their closeness grew undeniable. They sat together at meals, whispered in corners, disappeared for long walks that stretched into the evening. And every time I saw them together, a sharp, twisting pain coiled in my stomach. One night, I found myself walking toward the lake, drawn by the need to escape the suffocating weight of it all. The water was still, reflecting the moonlight in shattered silver ripples. I sat at the edge of the dock, staring at my reflection, trying to reconcile the person I saw with the one I had been before that kiss. A part of me wanted to hate Ariv, wanted to believe that he had used me, that he had never really felt what I had felt. But another part of me, perhaps the more dangerous part, wanted to believe that he was just scared, that he was running because the truth of us was too much to bear. I was still lost in thought when I heard voices drifting through the trees. His voice, and hers, the ultimate betrayal. I don't know why I stayed hidden. Maybe I already knew what I was about to hear and wanted to spare myself the pain of seeing it unfold before me. I don't know why people keep asking. Arv was saying, his voice light, careless. It was nothing. Just a stupid moment that got out of hand. I felt my breath catch. Mira laughed softly. So it wasn't true? What they said about you and… No, Arv cut her off, his tone sharper than before. It was a mistake. That's it. A mistake. The word lodged itself in my chest like a blade, twisting deeper with every breath. I should have walked away then. I should have turned and left before I heard what came next. But I didn't, because in the next instant, she whispered something too quiet for me to hear. And then, through the shifting leaves, I saw them. Her hands on his face, his lips on hers. I felt the ground disappear beneath me. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the finality of it, the confirmation of everything I had feared. The way he had chosen her, not just in front of others, but in private. The way he had erased me with a few careless words and a kiss that was meant for someone else. Something inside me shattered. Confrontation. I don't remember walking back to the house. I don't remember pushing open the door to our shared room or the way my hands trembled as I clenched them into fists. All I remember is the crushing weight of betrayal sitting heavy in my chest. Minutes passed, maybe hours, before Arv finally entered the room. He froze when he saw me, as if he could sense the storm in my gaze. "You heard," he said quietly. I let out a hollow laugh, one that felt foreign in my own throat. "Yeah, I heard." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "It's not. Don't." I cut him off, my voice cold. "Don't lie to me." For the first time, he looked away, and that hurt more than anything. "I thought we…" My voice cracked, and I hated myself for it. "I thought what happened between us meant something." "It didn't," he said too quickly. "It was a mistake." I finished for him. His silence was the only answer I needed. I nodded, forcing down the lump in my throat. "I get it." Arv stepped forward. "Listen, Save it," I said, my voice hollow. "I don't need an explanation, because what could he say that would change anything?" He had already chosen his answer, and it wasn't me. The breaking point. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I was suffocating under the weight of something I couldn't name. Arv slept just a few feet away, but he felt 1,000 miles from me. For the first time since that summer began, I realized I didn't know him at all. And maybe, just maybe, I never had. The morning after Arv's betrayal, the house felt different, quieter, as if the weight of unspoken words and shattered trust had seeped into its walls, silencing everything. The sounds of breakfast, distant laughter, the clinking of plates were muffled, as if the universe itself was giving me space to process what had happened. I didn't want space. I wanted to disappear. Arv hadn't spoken to me since last night. He didn't need to. His silence, the heavy, suffocating kind, had already said enough. I stayed in bed long after everyone else had gone outside for the day. The sunlight streamed through the window, golden and warm, but it couldn't reach the cold that had settled inside me. Everything felt different now, like the world had shifted slightly off its axis, leaving me in unfamiliar terrain. I had spent years believing that Arv and I were unbreakable, that no matter what, we would always find our way back to each other. But love, I was realizing, wasn't always enough to keep someone close. Sometimes, love was just a lesson in loss. The last conversation. By midday, I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. When I finally stepped outside, the heat wrapped around me like a second skin. Arv stood by the lake, skipping stones across the surface, his posture tense. For a brief, foolish moment, I thought about turning around, retreating before he could see me. But I was tired of running. I walked toward him, my footsteps crunching softly against the dirt. He heard me but didn't turn. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Arv sighed, letting the last stone slip from his fingers. It hit the water with a dull plop, sending ripples outward. I don't know what you want me to say, he admitted. I let out a hollow laugh. That's the problem, Ariv. You never do. He turned to face me then, and for the first time in days, I saw something real in his eyes. Guilt, regret, maybe even something deeper. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said. That doesn't change the fact that you did. His jaw tensed. It wasn't supposed to happen. The kiss, the feelings. I don't know what's wrong with me. I swallowed hard. Nothing is wrong with you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of earth and water. I was scared, he admitted finally. I didn't know how to deal with it. With us. And running to Mira was easier? His face twisted in something like shame. I thought if I could prove to myself that what happened between us didn't mean anything, then maybe, he trailed off, looking down. Maybe you wouldn't have to face the truth? I finished bitterly. Ariv exhaled sharply. I don't know what the truth is. I shook my head. Yes, you do. You just don't want to admit it. His eyes met mine, searching. But I had nothing left to give. A choice. I loved you, I whispered, the words tasting like goodbye. Ariv flinched, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. I cut him off. Don't say it if you don't mean it. Silence. And in that silence, I understood. Ariv might have felt something for me. Might have wanted me in some quiet, hidden part of himself, but he wasn't ready to face it. And maybe he never would be. And I couldn't keep waiting for someone who was too afraid to choose me. I took a step back. This isn't just about the kiss or Mira or any of it. It's about you not being honest with yourself. And I can't keep breaking myself apart trying to make you see what's right in front of you. Ariv inhaled sharply, his throat working around words he didn't say. I turned to leave. Wait, he said, his voice cracking. I paused, but I didn't turn back. Are we? He hesitated. Is this it? A lump formed in my throat, but I forced myself to nod. Yeah, I think it is. And then, before he could change my mind, I walked away. A new beginning. The rest of the summer passed in a blur. Ariv and I became ghosts in each other's lives. Polite in front of our families. Distant when no one was looking. He stayed with Mira, though I never asked if they were truly happy. I had my answer. When the summer ended, we packed our bags and returned to our separate lives. I thought leaving would make it easier. That distance would erase the ache in my chest. But heartbreak doesn't work that way. It lingers, a dull ache beneath the skin. A scar you learn to live with. But scars mean healing. Months passed, then years. The wound faded, and with time, so did the weight of what had happened. I stopped replaying that summer in my head. Stopped wondering what might have been if things had gone differently. Because in the end, Ariv was a lesson. A lesson in love. A lesson in loss. A lesson in letting go. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.